having these columns of workers turned soldiers walking against each other, marching against each other, slaughtering each other. Now that kind of war is most unlikely to happen in today's world because of the changes in the way things are produced these days. War resembles the global production networks. And again, it's very hierarchical. Control is centered among white people in the Western world. They are the guys who don't sit in the trenches, who don't have to do the shooting and the killing and the dying. They are the guys just having joysticks, high tech. And if you do need boots on the ground, you do everything you can, and Uncle Sam knows that better than anybody else after the disasters in Afghanistan and Iraq. It's better to hire local people. So the standing armies with their marching columns of soldiers have been replaced by this combination of, let's say, highly skilled, trained professionals, engineers, and mercenaries around them. It's also much cheaper to just hire them for a shooting and killing job and lay them off later without bearing the cost of, for example, paying them a pension after service. And of course, the types of wars also have changed in the sense that it's not the big powers fighting against each other. It's actually more like it has been prior to 1914. If you read European history books, they're always full of, there were decades of peace in Europe. It was a peaceful world. While if you ask people from the global south, the then colonies, they can tell you there wasn't peace at all. The colonial powers were constantly waging war against the peoples of the world. And this is exactly what we are seeing these days also. But we also see struggles that look very much like the struggles that the socialists 100 years ago had in mind when they talked about class struggle. Just most of that has moved from the Western industrial countries to the now workshops and sweatshops of the world, with China probably being the center of these types of workers' struggles that look very much like the struggles that Frederick Engels had described in his famous 1843, if memory serves, condition of the working class in England. So if you want to get an impression what Manchester looked like in those days, take a look at Chinese factories. Because in 1914, the resistance had collapsed. There was the Second International, which had declared until right into the first days of August that it would stop the war effort of the ruling classes of Europe. They would not send workers from one country to shoot workers from another country. While comes the declaration of war, all of that was forgotten in a second, literally in a second. But certainly the organized working classes of Europe had utterly failed because those who were still opposed to war were not able to push these converted nationalist social democratic leaders on the side and say, get out of the way, we have to stop the war. But it did happen over the course of the war. Really amazing how quick that happened. That new socialist movements, which then called themselves communist, sprang up. And they did understand that you have to make a link in a world that is not only divided between capitalists and workers, but also between colonizing powers and colonized people, that you have to make a link between socialism and anti-imperialism. And those who kind of went ahead first, obviously, were our Russian comrades, the Bolsheviks, and what they had in mind was still in the kind of tracks of 19th century socialism, assuming that the revolution in Russia would remind the workers of Europe and the other industrial countries, namely the US, Canada, Japan, of their duty to collectively build socialism. without much thinking strategically what that would imply for the colonized people of the world. But as we all know, this did not lead to the global rule of socialism or communism. These struggles were defeated. So that today, speaking about resistance, we are much less confident than the ones who came before us. And this lack of confidence leads to disorientation in terms of who actually are we fighting against. If we want to be anti-imperialist, sure, you are against Uncle Sam and the buddies in the West, that's an easy one. But who are your potential allies? Are there anti-imperialist regimes somewhere? On a more practical level, how do you get out of this imperialist world, which is now, as we all know, globalized, the buzzword since the 90s until today? Well, there are some cautious efforts to de-link in Latin America. Until July 1914, socialists thought they are unstoppable. Then they were derailed by the war effort for 3 years, but then they had this enormous comeback. History was on our side, and some would actually claim that they were able to prove scientifically that there is no alternative to socialism. This is how it was in those days. You had capitalists who thought, well, I hate it, but probably it can't be avoided. And what couldn't be avoided was socialism. But if you look back and ask, what did they actually mean by socialism, you start wondering, well, I'm not so sure about that. One of the scientific ideas was showing that capitalism is a chaotic system. It's totally irrational. There's the anarchy of the markets. And that just produces chaos, disorder. Nobody knows what's going on. And we have to organize and build a more rational society. And what does a rational society looks like? Well, we need some planning. And some of the blueprints for the planning were actually delivered by engineers working in and for capitalist corporations. Most famous of them is Frederick William Taylor, who also had the idea of organizing capitalist production more rationally than had happened before. And he knew perfectly well, and he was absolutely right, that his rational planning was very good for the profits of the people who hired people like him, Taylor. But those ideas were also adopted by socialists. And what came out of that, we had 70 years of experience, had this experiment for 70 years, was, yes, a bureaucracy. Lots of socialist Marxists were very quick at pointing out, well, that's not socialism, that's just a stupid bureaucracy, which it surely was. But it was not even as efficient as the designers of that system had thought. It was a bureaucratic anarchy. Everybody who knows bureaucracy today in the capitalist world has an impression how there's nothing efficient about bureaucracies. This is true, for example, if you try to get a room in a partially commodified university like Simon Fraser University, and it was also true in the Soviet Union. The idea of having the anti-colonial revolution, as good and necessary as it certainly was, of course also had its shortcomings. It underestimated the desire of some people, just like in the Soviet Union, where some ambitious working class kids figured, well, this is a chance to get away from the assembly line. This is a chance to sit in a cushy chair, become a bureaucrat. In the global south, you also had ambitious people who quickly would fill the ranks of what Marxists would then call the comprador bourgeoisies, those who were sucking up to the Western masters just to get their share of the pie and keep on screwing the people of the south. We have a multitude of struggles. It's difficult to maintain oversight. As early as '94, so that's just 20 years ago, not 100 years, we had the Zapatistas saying, ya basta, it's enough. Nobody really knew what they wanted, and they were quite open and said, we don't know what we want either, but we start doing it anyways. And as stupid as it sounds, it resonated with lots of people, and it inspired people in the global north to start something which became known as the World Social Forum. Yes, I know it says World Social Forum, but by and large it was still, and that's a problem of course, dominated by progressives from Western countries. Later this, or actually just very short time ago, similar arguments or slogans came out from the Idle No More movement here in Canada. And that, of course, is part of a much larger indigenous movement where it's also not quite clear what they are for. It's pretty clear what they're against. It's all in the spirit of this, we had enough of this, and we do not want to see the whole world turned into commodities that can be bought and sold. Now, I think ultimately the crisis that we are facing today is not a crisis of capitalism. Yes, capitalism has its crisis, but it's remarkably good at surviving them and drawing strength from its crisis. If you beat down capitalism, it gets on its feet again and fights back. Maybe something we should look at and try to learn from that. I would argue the crisis today is ultimately a crisis of socialism, of the socialist left, which is either totally absent or has taken refuge to very abstract claims that do not help us very much in struggle. Of course, it's easy for me to denounce capitalism and point out all its injustices, and it's also easy to say there's only one alternative, and that is a revolution that brings about socialism. But of course, I'll be speechless if anybody dares to ask me what that actually means, that socialism. And we have to take that serious, I think. And in that regard, we also we not only learn from the history of imperialism, it's not only important to know your enemy, it's also important, I would actually say it's even more important, to know about our own weaknesses and failures, not to get discouraged, but to take it as a point of departure for saying, we won't make those mistakes again and try. Of course, we will always make mistakes, but maybe we could avoid a few. We are still very much in the Zapatista mode of resistance. We are still not exactly knowing where we are going, but we try to go anyways. But I do think we have to make an effort not to declare the principle to go somewhere where you don't even know where you're going, because it can easily mean that you're just running around in circles. So this is an invitation to rethink international socialism for the rest of the 21st century.
Hello.
Hello, are you Mr. British Columbia?
Yes, I am.
Did you order some democracy pizza?
Yes, I did.
Well, we've got 3 types here for you.
All right.
This one is called representative democracy.
Oh, that's a 200-year-old.
First past the poll.
First, yeah, that's an
What do you
old kind
think?
of representation.
What do you think?
Yes, it smells old.
Old, okay. Well, let's try this one. It's representative democracy, but it's proportional democracy. Now,
Yes, that's-
in 2005, 57% of your neighbors wanted this kind of pizza.
Well, that empowers the parties. I want
it
to
does.
empower myself, the individual.
Well, the radio said just a couple weeks ago, 67% of your neighbors wanted this kind. It looks good to me.
Yeah,
Looks
yes.
good.
Well, it's better than.
We've got one
Some
more
other
kind here. Now,
ones.
this is very new. Very
Yes.
tasty, I've heard. Now, this is called direct democracy pizza.
I like that.
In 1991, 83% of your neighbors
Yes.
wanted this. Let's see. That smells good. Okay, well, what kind would you like? Either proportional or direct democracy?
I like direct democracy. Why
All
would I
right.
give my power to somebody else to represent me when I can represent myself?
Smells good. Okay, well,
Direct
enjoy.
democracy. Thank you.
Enjoy your direct democracy.
Yummy.